This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Innistrad Crimson Vow. So far I've covered every single card in the set that isn't green, so today that's the color we're looking at. A few caveats before we get to our first card. Keep in mind I'm only talking about limited, I'm not talking about other formats or any cards that don't appear in draft boosters for this set. Also, these are my initial thoughts about the format before playing with the cards. I will put out videos with my updated thoughts on these cards over the next several weeks. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to help sum up my thoughts on each of these cards. If you don't know what those letter grades mean, there's an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first green card. First up, it's Apprentice Sharpshooter, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/4 human archer at common. It's got reach, and it has training. This is a new mechanic in the set, and it says, whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, so it's reverse mentor. So, this seems pretty solid. A 3-mana 1/4 with reach is always kind of an alright playable, like a C-, and this one's training upside is pretty real. If you end up playing this on turn 3, you'll often find that it isn't that important you have a blocker, but attacking with a 1/4 normally isn't worth it either, but now if you attack with almost anything else, it'll become a 2/5, which, definitely matters over the course of the game. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Ascendant Pack Leader, which for 1 green is a 2/1 wolf at rare, and it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if you control a permanent with mana value 4 or greater. And whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, you put a +1/+1 counter on Ascendant Pack Leader. 1-mana 2/1s often disappoint in limited, since they quickly get outmatched early and aren't very good late, but the Pack Leader makes sure that won't be an issue, since it can get bigger throughout the game, and come down as a 1-mana 3/2 in the later game, which is a decent deal. So if you play it early, it'll get bigger and be relevant, and if you play it late, it'll have enough size that it probably matters. It still isn't incredible in limited like it will be in constructed, just because building a hardcore aggro deck isn't possible, because you're not going to have a critical mass of the cards you need to really make this card work, but I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. +1/+1 counters also have a little bit of synergy in this set. Next up, it's Avabruck Caretaker, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 human werewolf at mythic rare. It has hexproof, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on another target creature you control, and it has daybound. That's a returning mechanic. It means that day and night start to be counted once a card with daybound enters the battlefield, and it becomes night if no spells are cast during a player's turn. It becomes night on that next turn, and if it's already night, or if it becomes night when the caretaker's in play, it becomes Hallowhenge Huntmaster, which is a 6/6 with hexproof. Other permanents you control have hexproof, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. This is insanely strong. Even if it was just the front side, it would be excellent. Between the hexproof and the ability to permanently buff your creatures, it would probably be like an A-. Once it transforms, it becomes completely absurd, pumping your entire board and granting it hexproof, and it's just an insane bomb. Probably the biggest one in the entire format. I'm glad it's at mythic rare. I'm giving it an A+. Next up, it's Bramble Armor, which for 1 generic and a green is a common artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control. Equipped creature gets +2/+1, and it has an equip cost of 4. We just saw this in the last set, and it wasn't very good, even with the free equip, and it really underperformed. It kind of looked like maybe it'd be useful for helping you get Coven, but that just didn't come up enough. While this format has training, and you might think this would be helpful for training creatures, I'm kind of skeptical about it just because of how it panned out last time, and I'm going to start it at a D+. Next up, it's Bramble Worm, which for 6 generic and a green is a 7/6 worm at uncommon. It's got reach and trample. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 5 life, and you can pay 2 generic and a green and exile it from your graveyard to gain 5 life. This is a pretty nice thing to ramp into, and a good finisher in general. It will really allow you to stabilize between its size and the life it gains you. It's too bad it doesn't draw you a card like some other big worms we've seen recently, but even without that, this looks like a nice top curve for slower decks. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Cartographer's Survey, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says, look at the top 7 cards of your library, put up to 2 land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is an interesting take on explosive vegetation. Most of the time when you cast this, you will be getting 2 lands. The thing that makes it worse than Vegetation and other cards like it, though, is that this won't reliably help you fix your mana or anything like that. It definitely improves your chances, of course, but because you usually run about 1 land that produces splash mana, your chances aren't great. So this is mostly a ramp spell, and it is good at that, even if it is pretty clunky. Casting this on turn 4 in some games just won't be something you can do if you're getting beat down. Right now, I don't see myself playing this other than in the rampiest of decks. It does help you ramp into that worm we just talked about, and another interesting thing about it is it can hit any land. The problem with that, for this format, for Limited, is that doesn't really matter. Sure, maybe you hit your Evolving Wilds or your Voldaren Castle, but that's not especially impressive in Limited. Obviously, this has more applications in Constructed, where grabbing any land can be particularly powerful. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Cemetery Prowler, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 wolf at Mythic Rare. It's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile a card from a graveyard, and spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each spell type they share with cards exiled with Cemetery Prowler. A 3-mana 3/4 with Vigilance is probably a C+ at the very worst, and the additional value here is nice. It lets you hate on the graveyard while also reducing the cost of your spells, which is something you're definitely interested in. Going after a creature first will usually be the best plan, as we have more of those than anything else, and you'll exile whatever you can when you can, since the abilities stack and you can keep exiling stuff. Sometimes you'll have to play this out on turn 3 with nothing in the yard, and that will feel kind of underwhelming, but it's still a 3-mana 3/4 with Vigilance, and you'll feel fine about that. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Cloaked Cadet, which for 4 generic and a green is a 2/4 human ranger at uncommon. It's got training, and whenever 1 or more plus and +1 counters are put on 1 or more human creatures you control, draw a card, the ability triggers only once each turn. This looks very strong. It has a pretty bad starting rate, but the stats it has work really well with training, because it will likely get a counter and likely become a 3/5 when you attack with it, which also nets you a card. Because it has that 5 toughness when it attacks with something bigger, it's going to be hard to take down in combat, and even if they do, you're probably getting a 2-for-1. And that's without taking into account having other ways to put counters on stuff. And yeah, all the cards with training are humans, so this is mostly a training payoff, but there are other ways to put counters on stuff too. This is going to be quite good, especially in the green-white color pair that really likes humans and +1/+1 counters. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Crawling Infestation, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep you may mill 2 cards. Whenever 1 or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere during your turn, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. This is very similar to a card from our last trip to Innistrad that was called Creeping Sensation. So similar that I thought it was a reprint at first. The main difference is that this checks for creatures that go to the graveyard and not lands, and it only triggers once each turn. But this is a pretty similar card, even if it is a little powered down. It really helps you out if you're interested in milling, and it cranks out insect tokens fairly often. Basically, you get to add to the board while also loading up your graveyard, and your own creatures dying will also give you tokens. That's a bit of a risk of milling yourself out, but based on how it worked out last time, you usually end up winning with all the graveyard value before that happens. You aren't going to want to play this if you're an aggro deck, of course, but if you're any sort of grindy graveyard deck, this is a very impressive engine. I think I want to give this a build-around grade since it's so bad in some decks, so let's say it's a D in your typical deck and a B in a graveyard deck. Next up, it's Crushing Canopy, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says choose 1, destroy target creature with flying, or destroy target enchantment. There are flyers and enchantments in this set, of course, but not really enough of either to main deck this in most cases. Even blowing up a Disturb aura with this isn't great, as most of the time you're trading a whole card for a half of one. It's a fun card out of your sideboard, but a D in your main deck and a C out of the sideboard. Next up, it's Cultivator Colossus, which for 4 generic and 3 green is a star plant beast at Mythic Rare. It has trample, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. And when it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat this process. In your typical game of Limited, this is likely to just be a big trampler. In an ideal world, you would wait to play it until you can put a land into play with its Enter the Battlefield ability, because then it becomes at least a 2-for-1. But getting to 7 mana in Limited takes a while, so hoping you get that 8th is some wishful thinking. Obviously, the fact it can do that is definitely upside, so it isn't just a big trampler, but I think it will play out that way a lot. I think this is a B-, and if anything, I might be overrating it. Next up, it's Donhart Disciple, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 common human warlock. Whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a very nice 2-drop, one that will often be a 3/3 when you're curving out. I'm giving it a C+. It's going to be a really nice 2-drop to have, especially in green-white. Next up, it's Dig Up, which for 1 green mana is a rare sorcery, and it has Cleave for 1 generic, 2 black, and a green. This is a new mechanic in the set that lets you ignore text within the card's text box that is inside of square brackets, and generally, if you pay the extra mana, you get a more powerful card. This one says, search your library for a basic land card and reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. And basic land and reveal it are what's in square brackets. So even if this didn't have the cleave upside, this is a card you'll play in any green deck where you're splashing. 1 mana to tutor up a land is something we've seen in the past be solid, so the additional upside of this tutoring up anything later definitely matters. The funny thing is, if this was only the cleave effect, it wouldn't be good and limited. In fact, it would be unplayable. So keep that in mind. 4 mana is a lot to tutor something up, and we've never seen a card that did that alone be good and limited. That's because you're basically paying a huge tax to get 1 card out of your deck, not impact the board at all, so unless that card wins you the game on the spot, that often isn't worth it. But when you have 2 modes on a card, one of which is that it helps fix your mana really early in the game, this even really kind of lets you play 1 less basic land in your deck, at least if you're base green. And then, in the late game, the fact that it can tutor the thing up is nice, because, it's not true that every single time you could tutor something for 4 mana, it's going to be bad. It's just going to be bad on average, but there will be situations where cleaving this is going to feel great because it helps you find your bomb or whatever. Overall, the whole package here is just a C. Next up, it's Dormant Grove, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then, if that creature has toughness 6 or greater, transform Dormant Grove and it becomes Gnarled Grove Strider, a 3/6 with vigilance, and other creatures you control have vigilance. This sort of enchantment always feels pretty good. It gives you value the turn you play it, and then it can kind of start to snowball. When we've seen this kind of aura be really great, it usually costs around 3 mana, so this is a bit more expensive than I'd like, but the upside that it can become a pretty nice creature when you need it to is pretty nice. The green-white deck also really likes +1/+1 counters and can get some extra value out of it, and it's also good in the high toughness deck, which is black-green. Overall, I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Flourishing Hunter, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/6 wolf spirit at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain life equal to the greatest toughness among other creatures you control. It's pretty likely that this gains you 3 or more life, and that will feel pretty good if you're trying to stabilize. It fits in nicely in the black-green deck, which might have a 1/13 in play, in which case this is a 6 mana 6/6 that gains you 13 life, which is going to feel pretty sweet. Mostly, this is just sort of like the Colossal Dreadmoss slot. It's a 6 mana 6/6 with decent upside that you'll play in decks looking for top curve at 6. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Glorious Sunrise, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a rare enchantment, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose 1. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. Target land gains tap, add 3 green mana until end of turn. Draw a card if you control a creature with power 3 or greater, or you gain 3 life. It's nice that this gives you something the turn you play it, and the options are mostly pretty appealing. +1/+1 and trample to the whole board is definitely the one that you can get the most mileage out of, but if your board isn't wide enough for that to matter, you can take advantage of the mana or draw a card, and the worst case is that you gain 3 life, which, while not amazing at first, is the kind of thing that when triggered over and over can make it pretty hard for your opponent to take you down, and really, obviously, any of these triggers over and over is pretty powerful. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Hamlet Vanguard, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/1 human warrior. At rare, it's got Ward 2, and when it enters the battlefield, it does so with 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each other non-token human you control. This can end up being quite large, especially in green-white, a deck that cares about both humans and the counters. On the flip side, it can also just be a 3 mana 1/1 with Ward 2, not something you would ever play. It also has no evasion, so it can be chump blocked for days. So, yeah, even though this guy can be massive and Ward makes him harder to kill, the setup cost is a lot for something that doesn't have that high of a ceiling. It's not bad. You'll play it in every green deck, and especially in green-white decks, but I don't think it's so good you want to first pick it very often. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Hiveheart Shaman, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/5 human shaman at rare. When it attacks, you may search your library for a basic land card that doesn't share a land type with the land you control, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. And you can pay 5 generic and a green to create a 1/1 green insect creature token, put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control, activate only as a sorcery. So 4 mana for a 3/5 isn't a terrible place to start. That's decent defensive stats, and this card has a lot more going on. In a typical limited deck, you may not be able to take advantage of the attack trigger. In fact, I kind of hope you don't have to take advantage of the attack trigger, because it probably means your color's screwed on only 1 color of mana, but if you're splashing, there's a good chance it will help you out. Most of the card's value, though, comes from its ability to churn out insect tokens. They're going to be 3/3s or better in almost any deck, and while spending 6 on that isn't incredible, it is a repeatable way to add a very real body to the battlefield, and if you're splashing, this makes sure you find that 3rd land, and then you're making 4/4s, and that's quite the deal. It's too bad you can only use it at sorcery speed, but it's still a nice mana sink. I think overall this gives you a B. Next up, it's Hookhand Mariner, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 human werewolf at common. It's got Daybound, and its werewolf side is Rip Hook Raider, a 6/4 that can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. This is a nice common werewolf, something they kind of could have used in the last set. A 4 mana 4/4 is pretty close to a straight up C. It's just not a line we see a lot in limited. And when this transforms, it gets bigger and becomes significantly harder to block. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Howling Moon, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare enchantment. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target wolf or werewolf you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And whenever an opponent casts their 2nd spell each turn, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. So you pretty much need to be in a werewolf deck for this to be worth it, because the other part of the card won't produce tokens often enough for this to sort of power itself. It's especially bad to get this in the later part of the game when players are struggling to find spells to cast in the first place. But if you have enough wolves and werewolves, the card is fairly appealing, as +2/+2 to one of them every turn is sure to make your attacks a lot better, and getting the free wolf token from time to time will be great extra value. I do think this needs a build around grade though. It's probably a D in a regular old green deck, and more like a B- in a red-green deck loaded up with wolves and werewolves. It's nice too, it sort of punishes your opponent for making it daytime again. That's sort of the flavor here. So it does have additional extra value if you're in red-green, because you're going to want it to be nighttime more than any other deck, and your opponent's going to want to make it day more than they want to against any other deck, and you get a token when that happens. Next up, it's Howlpack Piper, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/2 human werewolf at rare. It can't be countered. You can pay 1 generic and a green and tap it to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. If it's a wolf or a werewolf, you untap Howlpack Piper, activate only as a sorcery, and its Nightbound side is a 4/4 called Wild Song Howler, and whenever this creature enters the battlefield or transforms into Wild Song Howler, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this type of Elvish Piper card is one of the easiest things for players, especially new players, to overrate. This is because it's easy to imagine just paying 2 mana and slamming something massive on the board, and yeah, it can do that, but you'd be surprised how often the ability just doesn't matter, especially in limited. It basically becomes unimportant as early as the mid-game unless you have some really expensive cards. It's at its best if you use the ability on turn 5 to play a 6 or 7 mana card, but in limited, it isn't like you'll have lots of those. When you draw something like this late, it's just a very inefficient creature. Once this transforms, though, the ability is way better, and it's just a way better card. It actually lets you draw cards, which at that point is far better than trying to cheat creatures into play. So if you can shift back and forth and keep drawing creatures, you can also potentially get something massive to cheat into play with the human, but you'll even find when you're drawing those extra creatures, you may not have a reason to do it. It's an interesting card. If it was just the Howlpack Piper side, I'd probably be sitting at a C. If it was just Wild Song Howler and this was an Enter the Battlefield ability, I'd probably be at B+ or A-, and I think sort of the combo here of both of these together is a B. Next up, it's Infestation Expert, which for 4 generic and a green is a 3/4 human werewolf at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token, and its Nightbound side is a 4/5 called Infested Werewolf, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you create 2 1/1 green insect creature tokens. I'd be pretty happy playing this card even if it didn't transform. 5 mana for 4/5 worth of stats across 2 bodies is sort of the fail case, and it can churn out tokens. So if it was just Infestation Expert, I'd probably be at about a C+. Then, the Werewolf side is way more impressive, attacking harder and making more tokens, and obviously as a 4/5, it's more likely to be able to attack in the first place. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Laid to Rest, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever a human you control dies, you draw a card, and whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you gain 2 life. This is here almost entirely for the green-white deck, which is about humans and +1/+1 counters, as I've said in this video, and in that deck, this is going to be impressive. Drawing cards and gaining life is really going to enable you to grind out wins. Sure, costing 4 and not adding to the board in a concrete way is kind of a big deal, but the good news is that while it may not actually add something to the board, it does alter the board, in the sense that your opponent now has to deal with the fact that if they attack you, you can threaten to gain life and draw cards. This is definitely a build around, but I think one that has a high enough ceiling that you probably want to take it kind of early. Your typical green deck will have a few humans and counters, so it isn't a straight up F outside of green-white, but it's probably a D and a straight up B in a humans deck. Next up, it's Massive Might, which for 1 green is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. It feels like the last few sets have had some pretty legit tricks, and this is another one. 1 mana tricks tend to be pretty nice in aggressive decks, as you get some serious tempo when you use them to win combat, and this one is definitely giving you enough of a boost to be worth running in those decks. It is of course still a trick, and those always come with risks, but I think this one is nice enough that you'll play the first copy in most of your aggro decks, giving it a C. Next up, it's Moldgraph Millipede, which for 4 generic and a green is a 2/2 insect horror at common. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards, and then put a +1/+1 counter on the millipede for each creature card in your graveyard. This is an alright payoff for the blue-green deck, which is about the graveyard. The thing that kind of bothers me about it is it only cares about creature cards in the graveyard, and there are going to be times where even with the mill from this, you're getting like a 4/4 or a 3/3, and you should kind of expect that to happen. I mean, there will be times in the later game where it's like an 8/8 and loads up your graveyard, and that's nice, but it has a pretty ugly baseline in a deck that's not doing an excellent job of loading up the graveyard. So this really only has 1 home in the format and only in sort of the most graveyardy decks of all of them, and I think that means it's just a C-. Next up, it's Mulch, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put all land cards revealed this way into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. This is a reprint, and it's another card that really only has 1 home in the format, basically the blue-green deck, because you want to be milling yourself in that deck, and this will throw a bunch of cards in the graveyard, while also helping you hit land drops, which is pretty nice. I think this one needs a build around just because I don't really see a reason you'd ever play this at all outside of a blue-green deck. I think it's probably a D. I guess that means you can play it, like, because, you know, at least it's giving you some cards. But you pretty much don't want to play it, and it's more like a C in the blue-green deck. Next up, it's Nature's Embrace, which for 2 generic and a green is a common aura. It has enchant creature or land. As long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +2/+2, and as long as enchanted permanent is a land, it has tap, add 2 mana of any 1 color. This has a neat design. It's either a mediocre aura or a mediocre way to fix and ramp. Each card individually is probably like a D+, and you probably won't play this at all if you don't need fixing in the first place, but the flexibility is enough for me to get it up to a C-. Next up, it's Oak Shade Stalker, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 human ranger werewolf at uncommon, and you can cast it as though it had flash if you pay 2 more to cast it, and its Nightbound side is a 6/3. So, if it's daytime, this is either a 3 mana 3/3 or a 5 mana 3/3 with flash. If it's nighttime, things get a little interesting, because you still can choose to spend the extra mana for flash, because when this card's in your hand, it's always Oak Shade Stalker. Then, once it goes on the stack and enters the battlefield, if it's nighttime, the other side will come in, but you still get the benefit of the effect that happens when it's in your hand. So that means it can be a 5 mana 6/3 with flash too if it's nighttime, and obviously that's a creature that can kill almost anything in combat, although it's also pretty likely to die with only 3 toughness. But overall, this has a solid baseline and a nice bit of upside, and I think that's enough for a C+. Next up, it's Pack Song Pup, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 wolf at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control another wolf or werewolf, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, you gain life equal to its power. This is a nice werewolf payoff. In a deck with wolves and werewolves, this can become quite large, and if it dies, gaining some life is some nice value. It takes time to set up, and it starts fragile, so I'm not sure I want to be first picking it, but it seems like a quality card for red-green decks in the format. To a lesser extent, also green-white decks. Most werewolves, all werewolves, on the front at least, are humans, so you're getting the human payoff and the werewolf payoff at the same time, for various cards of yours if you're playing them. Yeah, and overall, I think this is probably a C+. Next up, it's Reclusive Taxidermist, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/2 human druid at uncommon. It gets +3/+2 as long as there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. You would always play a 2 mana 1/2 that can add mana of any color. That's like a C+ at worst. That's just great fixing a nice ramp in the early game. So the fact that in the later part of the game it actually has a very real body as a 4/4 is pretty nice. Most of your mana dorks don't do anything in the later part of the game. This one does. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Retrieve, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says return up to 1 target creature card and up to 1 target non-creature permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, exile Retrieve. This doesn't look great. It won't be easy to actually get back 2 cards with it. Sure, having a creature in your graveyard is pretty much going to happen, but having a non-creature permanent, not so much. In Limited, we're mostly talking about lands, artifacts, and enchantments, and those things don't routinely end up in the graveyard. Unless, of course, you're in a self-mill deck. In a deck like that, which is the blue-green deck, getting a land and a creature will be reasonably likely and not a bad deal. It also gets a little better if you have like 2 evolving wilds, because those will go in the graveyard. Still, this is only going to be good in some pretty specific decks. It's kind of playable everywhere. I don't quite think it needs a build-around grade, but it's going to definitely be at its best in a deck that's actively loading the graveyard, and I think it's difficult enough to make it work that it's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Rural Recruit, which for 3 generic and a green is a 1/1 human peasant at common. It's got training, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a 3/1 green boar creature token. This is a nice common. 4/2 worth of stats spread across 2 bodies isn't too bad for 4 mana, and it comes with the means to train itself right away. This turning into a 2/2 isn't exactly amazing, but it will definitely make your attacks on the turn after feel pretty good. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Sawblade Slinger, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 human archer at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, choose up to 1. Destroy target artifact an opponent controls, or Sawblade Slinger fights target zombie an opponent controls. So, a 4 mana 4/3 is like a D+ these days, if that's all this was, and the Slinger does come with extra value, but they are narrow abilities. The thing is, when you do get to use one of those abilities, you're getting a really nice 2-for-1. The fight part is the most exciting, but you won't always have a zombie to fight, and the same is true for artifacts. You're not going to always have an artifact to destroy, and there's going to be significant times where you play this and you don't have either. Both things, having both of these narrow things together does make it more flexible, but I can foresee a lot of situations where this is just a 4 mana 4/3, but it's going to feel wildly different. It's going to feel like a D+ when it doesn't do a thing, and like a B- when it has something to destroy. I think overall that means it's a C. Next up, it's Sheltering Boughs, which for 2 generic and a green is a common enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and the enchanted creature gets +1/+3. This aura replaces itself, which definitely upgrades it, but the stats boost isn't great. I think you'll cut this more than you play it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Snarling Wolf, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 wolf at common, and you can pay 1 generic and a green, and it gets +2/+2 until end of turn, activate only once each turn. This is another reprint from Midnight Hunt. It was solid there. It could come down early and help set up Coven. It'll probably be about the same here, except it will help set up Training instead. It's still nothing special and not something you always run. There are a lot of 2-drops that you'd rather just have than this 1-drop, but it's fine. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Spiked Ripsaw, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +3/+3. When the equipped creature attacks, you can sack a forest, and if you do, that creature gains trample until end of turn, and this has an equip cost of 3. This reminds me a lot of Plate Armor, and that's good company to keep because that was a very powerful card in its format. It costs the same to play and equip and gives the same stats boost, though Plate Armor had the benefit of also granting ward and can reduce its equip cost, and it was also in a format with an equipment deck, and this format doesn't have that. In place of that, though, Spiked Ripjaw can make your creature have trample, which is certainly nice. This is a big stats boost that makes almost any creature into a threat, and if you're putting this on something big and you can give it trample, it's going to be a real problem. I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Splendid Reclamation, which for 3 generic and a green is a rare sorcery. It says return all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is a reprint from Eldritch Moon, and it was a useless card in Limited last time, and it will be again. Maybe you end up in like the most self-milly ramp deck ever, and this maybe gets a little interesting, like you have 3 of those worms and a bunch of different cards that mill your whole deck, but like, it's not going to happen. This is just an F. Next up, it's Spore Crawler, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 fungus at common. When it dies, you draw a card. I like this. It doesn't do anything remotely fancy, but it has 2 for 1 written all over it, and I always like commons that can produce those easily. While it's not in the blue-black color pair, which is where all the exploit is, if you're in like a blue-green deck or a black-green deck, this isn't a bad thing to exploit either. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Sporeback Wolf, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 wolf at common, and as long as it's your turn, it gets +0/+2. We've seen 2 mana 2/2s with this box of text before, and it's decent upside. Being a 2/4, that's pretty good for 2 mana. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Toxic Scorpion, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 Scorpion at common. It's got Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, another target creature you control gains Death Touch until end of turn. This looks nice. A 2 mana 1/1 with Death Touch is probably already a C- or a C since it can trade for anything, and it really represents a problem all game long. Now, giving something Death Touch on your turn isn't quite as good as being able to give it on any turn, on your opponent's turn or your turn, but it will often enable you to attack with a creature who couldn't attack at all otherwise. Might help you set up training in a way. Overall, I like this card. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Ulvenwald Oddity, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/4 beast at rare. It's got trample and haste, and you can pay 5 generic and 2 green to transform it, and then it becomes an 8/8 called Ulvenwald Behemoth. It's a beast horror. It has trample and haste, and other creatures you control get +1/+1 and have trample and haste. A 4 mana 4/4 with trample and haste is something you'd always play. Adding the late game huge upside is no joke here, because it becomes much larger and pumps your whole board, and most of the time if you can transform this, it's going to end the game. It is expensive enough that I don't quite think this deserves to be a bomb in the sense that, you're not going to consistently get to the point where you can make this thing huge and end the game, but it's pretty close. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Weaver of Blossoms, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 human werewolf at common. It can tap for mana of any color. It's got Daybound, of course. The other side is Blossomclad Werewolf, a 3/4 that can tap for 2 mana of any one color. This is a decent source of fixing and ramp. It's got decent stats, and sometimes those stats are more than decent if it's nighttime, and it'll ramp even more at those times too. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Witch's Web, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. It says target creature gets +3/+3 and gains reach until end of turn, untap it. We see this trick a lot, and it's always passable. It gives enough of a boost that the creature usually wins combat, and it can even be used to ambush an attacking flyer, though typically you'd rather use this aggressively than defensively, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Wolf Strike, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. It says target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn if it's night. Then it deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. This is quite good. Even if it isn't nighttime, this would be good in green decks as the creature doesn't fight, it just does damage equal to its power. That makes it one-sided. If it is nighttime, it gets way better as it can make your creature take down a wider number of creatures and even offer you the opportunity to attack more effectively with the creature after it kills something. You do, of course, have to be careful with this kind of card, since you can get blown out if you don't pick your spot carefully, but because it's an instant, you can pick your spot pretty effectively. We've seen this card without the night upside be like a B- in the past, so I think the extra wrinkle makes this a B. It's premium removal in green, and probably green's best common. And our last card in this video is Kin Outcast, which for 5 generic and a green is a 5/4 human werewolf at uncommon, and it costs 2 less to cast if you control a wolf or werewolf. And its nightbound side is a 6/5 werewolf called Wedding Crasher, and whenever it or another wolf or werewolf you control dies, you draw a card. If you can curve out with a wolf on one of your first few turns, which looks very doable, this is going to be pretty nasty on turn 4 as a 5/4, especially because once it's nighttime, it comes with a pretty powerful werewolf payoff that makes sure you get to 2 for 1 your opponent when your werewolves die. And like with the similar card we saw, this actually will cost 2 less and still come into play as Wedding Crasher if it's nighttime. And obviously, if you're doing that consistently, it's insane. I do think we have to realize that it's not going to be nighttime as often as we want it to be in the werewolf deck, but this is still a pretty good card, giving it a B-. Well, those are my initial thoughts for all the green cards in Crimson Vow, and actually at this point, I've now given you my thoughts on every single card in the set. But there's still lots more Crimson Vow content to come out, including an archetype guide coming out tomorrow, a top 10 list about the best bombs, a video where I give my picks for the best commons and uncommons in the set, and of course draft videos. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch all that future content I just talked about, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on my other videos, including more of this set review, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you enjoy my content, you found this set review helpful, and you want to give back, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.